So here in the counter component, we want to remove the local state and only rely on the props to receive the data that this component needs. We refer to this kind of component as a controlled component. A controlled component doesn't have its own local state. It receives all the data via props and raises events whenever data needs to be changed. So this component is entirely controlled by its parent. So let's go ahead and do this refactoring. First, we're going to delete the state property. Next, we need to find any references to this.state and update them accordingly. The first reference is in our handle increment method. So since we no longer have the local state, it doesn't make sense to have this method here because this counter component is going to be a controlled component. So whenever the data needs to be modified, this component needs to raise an event and have its parent take care of modifying the data. So delete. Here's our increment button. Instead of referencing the handle increment method, which no longer exists, by calling a method in the props object, just like how we raised the onDelete event here. So let's get rid of this expression. We're going to pass an arrow function, and in the body of this function, we're going to call this.props.onIncrement. So that's the name of our event. Now, as an argument, we need to pass either the counter ID or a reference to this counter object. I'm going to pass a reference to the counter object because this will make the implementation of our event handler simpler, as you will see in a few seconds. So this.props.counter. We pass the entire counter object and let the event handler take care of incrementing the value of this counter. Now, let's find any more references to this.state. So we have two more references here that need to be modified. One is in getBatch classes. So here we need the value of the counter. We can read that from this.props.counter. Here's the last reference. So here we're using object destructuring to read the value property of the state. Since the state property is gone, we're going to read the value from this.props.counter. So we're done with the removing of the local state of the counter component. Here we no longer have a state property, and we're relying entirely on the props object to display data and notify changes. Now let's go back to our counters component. We need to add a new event handler, handle increment. We set this to a function that takes a counter parameter. For now, let's just do a console.log of counter to make sure all the plumbing is working before we move on to update the state. Next, we need to go to our render method. So earlier we handled the onDelete event. Now we handle onIncrement, and we set this to this.handleIncrement. Let's test the application up to this point. So save and back in the browser. I'm going to increment our first counter. So we get that counter object here with the value 4. Beautiful. Now we need to update the state. Just like before, we are not going to update the state directly. Instead, we should create a new counters array and give it to the setState method and have React update the state. So let's create a new constant, call it counters. We set it to a new array. And here I'm going to use the spread operator to clone this.state.counters. So we're cloning this array. With this, we'll get a new array of counters. However, the objects in this new array are exactly the same objects that we have in the counters array that we have in the state object. Let me show you. So if we go to our new counters array, get the first counter and increment its value, this is going to directly modify the value property of this counter object that we have in the state. So let's do a console.log of this.state.counters of 0. Save the changes back in the browser. I'm going to increment our first counter. Now we can see its value is 5. So we have modified the state directly. And this is a no-no in React. To solve this problem, we need to clone the counter at the given location. So we'll have a different object than the one in the state. We don't have to clone the other counter objects here because we're not going to modify them. So we set counters of 0 to a new object. And once again, we use the spread operator to clone this counter object that we receive as an argument here. Let's test the application one more time. Back in the browser. Now, if I increment the first counter, you can see the value is not updated. So the counter object that we have in the state remains unchanged. Now here we are working with the first counter in this array. Instead, we need to find the index of the counter that we receive as a parameter. So let's define a new constant, index, and we set it to counters.indexOf. We pass our counter object, and finally we replace all these zeros with index. And the last piece is to update the state. So we call this .setState and give it this new counters array. Let's test the application. Back in the browser, I'm going to increment the first counter. Beautiful. Let's delete some of these and click the reset. Perfect.